I'm Amy Sandine. I am on the Humanities Council Board, very privileged and proud to serve with an amazing group of people there. And you are here to learn from Dr. Danielle Battisti from UNO. This afternoon's session is entitled A Lost Consensus, Politics and Culture in the 1950s. And no, yes. Sorry, I'm reading and there's a typo on it.
Sorry.
So, is that why you were signaling me? Don't say that part. Dr. Danielle Battisti is an assistant professor of history at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, where she specializes in immigration and ethnic history. Her new book, Whom We Shall Welcome, Italian Americans and Immigration Reform, examines both liberal, case in point, examines both liberal and conservative elements of Italian American efforts to influence American immigration policies in the 1950s and 1960s. Thank you for being here. Please make sure your phones are silent and your ears are on and your brains are going. And welcome, Dr. Battisti.
Thank you. Humanities, Nebraska. Thank you to all of you who are giving up this beautiful day to being in the library and being here. Your brains are certainly on if these are the choices you've made today. Thanks for Jim for attending. I bet you many of you were able to catch his great talk last night. And I'm kind of picking up where he left off and where some of the questions took us in Q&A last night. There was this great question that someone asked about mythic narratives, a narrative of who we are as a people, and I said we're going to be talking about that very question for the next 24, 48 hours here. Like Jim, I sort of started out, I want to start out today by thinking about, we live in a deeply divided nation. That is a very troubling realization for many of us to come to terms with. No matter what side of the political or social spectrum you sort of consider yourself to be on, no one particularly likes living like that, right? As humans, we seek out groups, communities, and for many of us, a sense of nationhood or peoplehood. We crave belonging. And so I think it's somewhat natural, if misguided, that we met plenty of people today look back fondly on bygone eras in which we think about a consensus that once existed and we would like to reclaim. And when we're thinking about that, many people come back to the 1950s. This decade is still idealized by many Americans as a golden age in the United States. So I think today we want to be thinking about, number one, why is that the case, that many of us keep coming back to this decade? Number two, was the United States really a united nation with a sense of consensus that we project upon this decade today, or was this more of a facade? Number three, if there was a culture of consensus in this country, how and why did that break down? Which are, of course, very complicated answers that we can begin to scratch the surface of. And then finally, what do the answers to these questions still mean for us as a people in 2021? So maybe we can kind of brainstorm that together in the Q&A portion. So first and foremost, I think we have to think about what we mean when we think of the idea of consensus. What does that word mean to you? Maybe privately mull over that for 30 seconds or so while I'm talking. We could approach this a couple of ways, and certainly what I'm about to offer you is not the only way, but the things that I'm going to talk about when I think about consensus and the way we project this term to the 1950s is I think there are three major areas that people can look at and say there was a general degree of consensus when Americans think about their views on the economy, their views on domestic politics and foreign relations, and then some social relationships that we think about going on in the United States among peoples, right? So I want to start out by thinking about the way that Americans thought about politics and the economy in the 1950s. Because this was an era of functional governance, because of people like Dwight D. Eisenhower and others. It was an era in which domestic politics functioned, and let's just pause and appreciate that for a minute. And that is in large part because there was a general ideological agreement on the basis of sort of economic principles that enabled centrist parties to work together to pass legislation to govern. And a lot of this consensus revolved around economic philosophies in the nation. By the 1950s, there was a general acceptance of Keynesian economics. This idea had moved to the political and economic center of American politics by the end of World War II. So these are the ideas that began with progressives in the early 20th century and then sort of moved to the political center by FDR in the New Deal. These are philosophies that reformers had argued should be used to sort of restructure the economy and society. These are the ideas that unregulated capitalism was ruining American democracy. That corporate money and extreme income inequality amassed by folks like Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Carnegies was corrupting politicians and the policies that they produced. It was making elected officials unresponsive to the public good, and groundswells of voices of voters mattered less because of the economic influence of business elites. And we kind of get to the heyday of that in the 1890s. There's some regulation of this unrestricted capitalism, and then a pullback of that regulation in the 1920s with Coolidge, Hoover, and, oh, I'm missing one. Sorry?
Harding, maybe?
Harding. And so these sorts of reformers are arguing that we need to rethink about the relationship of society and the economy, or the way that the government intervenes in the economy. And FDR is able to center this message in the wake of the Great Depression and the political changes that result in the 1930s and 40s. So by the end of the 1940s, the center of American politics has sort of moved to thinking about modern industrial capitalism needing to be sort of checked by the government periodically, right? The government needs to check unregulated capitalism to protect regular people's liberties and freedoms from the power of corporations, moneyed elites, etc. So FDR changes the political center from the idea that people have freedoms to do something, which we now sort of have back in our mind frame after people like Milton Friedman come into vogue, and we'll get to him by the end of the lecture, to the idea that you have to have freedom from corporations taking away your rights, your political voice, etc. Right? And this became sort of the center of American politics by the 1950s. You have politicians on both sides of the aisle who agree that the government needs to regulate the political and economic scope of industrial capitalism. You have a general agreement that the government has to intervene periodically to stimulate moderate levels of economic redistribution, with things like progressive tax policies, with things like a American welfare state. Now, this is not an American welfare state that exists in places like Germany or Great Britain or Canada later in the 20th century. We're talking about a welfare state that is, arranged around things like Social Security, moderate redistributions of income to the aged, to the infirmed, to those that can't work. We're talking about support for public works projects in times of crisis so that the economy can prime the pump and sort of get things going when Adam Smith's invisible hand of the marketplace fails, right? And so we're talking about general agreement on Keynesian economic spending, that the economy should run by a mix of public and private sector spending when it's in the interest of the public good. So for 30 years or so, this basic blueprint was not truly challenged by either Democrats or Republicans, right? When Democrats and Republicans are having fights about things, they're generally having fights about how much do we spend on X, Y, or Z, or what are sort of the details of this new infrastructure project or things like that. The one major exception, maybe we could say, would be the fight over national health care in Truman's second term, and we can talk about that a little bit later. You know, last night Jim mentioned the Eisenhower Highway Act, or the Eisenhower highway system, as an example of this type of spending, or the types of policy initiatives that come out of Washington in this era is indicative of this kind of mindset. And that's certainly a major piece of legislation, probably the most famous and long-lasting, most impactful, that reflects this type of consensus on what the government should be doing, is the GI Bill passed in 1944, and which certainly has an impact on the economy and society in the 1950s. So the GI Bill is a social welfare program. We don't like to call it that because we have a language today in which we think about deserving and undeserving peoples and social welfare. But it is a government program that's primed to sort of regulate the economy. It's aimed to keep soldiers out of the workforce when they return home for periods of 6 months in technical training, 2 years in this school, 4 years at this university, and then to provide economic stimulus through educational benefits, through homeowner loans, and these types of things enable people to have upward social mobility. They enable people to become homeowners and have equity because of that, and they are inherently linked to stimulating the consumer economy on which this country is based, right? When you buy homes, you generally do so because you're growing a family to put in those homes. Families need lots of stuff, right? And so these are some great pictures from Elizabeth Cohen's book, and I've got a bibliography at the end here if you want to check it out, in which she's talking about this consumer economy that the GI Bill is meant to shore up, right? And so we've just got some of these images showing you about this economic culture of consumption that grows in the wake of programs such as these, right? And there is general agreement on both sides of the aisle that these are good things that are designed to grow the American economy and create a good life for Americans. If you take a look at this chart here, it's showing you that the years in which we had the least income inequality in this country are right around the 1950s and 60s, and they happen in no small part because of programs like these. Now, there are certainly other factors. You know, the fact that European industry has been devastated by war, and countries like China and India are not major global competitors yet, right? We're not crediting everything with programs like the GI Bill or the Keynesian spending that I'm talking about more broadly, but it certainly contributes to this graph. And if we were to follow it on forward, you can see where this graph continues to go after 2003. And to compare that to the Great Depression moment, just if you want to there. Okay, so we sort of think about this era as a consensus era because of the political economic philosophies on which our centrist parties were based, right? That they were guided by the same general principles. We also tend to think about this era as an era of consensus because both political parties shared a same foundation in terms of how they thought about U.S. foreign relations with the world, right? There was general agreement after World War II that the United States should really pay attention to the things that Woodrow Wilson was talking about in the First World War. That Wilson and some other sort of modern thinkers in the United States had really figured out a blueprint for how the United States should become an activist, interventionist actor in the world, and that ultimately these things were good for the United States' domestic security, our own self-interest, right? The Atlantic Ocean was shrinking, the United States could no longer sort of ignore problems in the world, and more voices are saying it's really time for the United States to step up to this world leadership position, assume sort of a police keeper center of the world mentality that nations like Great Britain had previously done, and kind of guide world events, right? It is within the United States' best interest to promote the growth of liberal democratic regimes around the world, because the United States comes to believe that when we have liberal democracies around us, we have more and more people who care about things like liberty, freedom, human rights, and the world is a better place because of that. The United States, or Americans, also come to believe that we should be promoting the growth of free trade capitalist societies throughout the world. We're not talking about unregulated capitalism, of course, but capitalism nonetheless. Because Americans generally believe, from FDR and Johnson, you know, these sort of liberals that we associate with reforming capitalism, that capitalism still provides the highest standard of living around the world to the most people. And also, when you have a free flow of goods, peoples, services around the world, you have vested interests and reasons not to attack the people that you are making money with, right? This is the whole idea why France tells Germany, let's have some coal and steel agreements and stop having war with one another in the 1950s and 60s, right? You also have cultural exchanges with people, and when you go on these business trips, you know, you go and eat at new restaurants, you hear new languages, new music, maybe you get married to someone from a foreign country, and all of a sudden the world is not so scary and maybe you have less reasons to go to war with other people, right? So the whole idea is that this free flow of ideas, democracy around the world, are going to give people a higher standard of living and also make the world safer. Because they're going to make the world safer because when people have a higher standard of living, they have a roof over their heads, a meal in their belly, and they're not worried about sort of basic things. They can say, hey, maybe I have time to think about, do I have this terrible autocrat leading my country, and maybe that's not a good thing, right? So generally, Americans believe that this helps to protect national security, right? And so we get to that final point. When all else fails, this quest for national security can also rely on institutions like the UN and the IMF and the World Bank and the WHO and all these other NGOs that the United States is also in the 1940s and 50s helping to promote around the world, right? So there is general agreement on all of these principles, which I didn't think until, like, I don't know, 8 years ago we had to talk about. And there is a real conversation to be had, especially about things like this, that are happening on both sides of the political spectrum today, right? About what is the utility of these kinds of things. So I'm not trying to belittle that. But there is a general consensus on these issues, and the Cold War is largely structured upon the idea that the United States is trying to promote this way of life around the world, and the Soviet Union has an alternative vision of how you achieve progress and modernity and national power as well, right? And we can go into that a little bit, but I think it will get us off track and kind of take a long time. So, as I said, Republicans and Democrats are not really fighting about these issues. Now, there are fights about how you best do these things. Liberals like Truman or Marshall or Senator Fulbright might make the argument that you best do these things by providing foreign aid, as we did in the Marshall Plan, or by making sure you can get a McDonald's in Moscow, or sending students to study in Czechoslovakia. And Republicans, like Nixon, like McCarthy, might worry more about things like, how many Air Force bases do we have in Germany? Do we have spies in the United States? Here's Nixon examining some of this film from the Pumpkin Patch in West Virginia, which, by the way, is a national park that gets like 3 visitors a year. And as I said, people like McCarthy trying to root out spies at home. So there are discussions about how you best approach the Cold War and fight the Cold War, but there is a general agreement that we should be fighting the Cold War for reasons like this, right? And that's a big deal. And so there is general agreement on things like passage of the Marshall Plan, the United States joining NATO, which the United States had never joined a standing military alliance before this period, invading Korea, things like that, right? There's general agreement on these kinds of Cold War initiatives. We also think of this period as this era. My third point in one of those initial slides was a period of consensus on social issues, right? We sort of think of the 1950s through these kinds of lenses. I think these are a lot of the images that still stay with us today. This was the era where suburbanization was supposed to provide personal fulfillment through a consumer-based society, right? We just talked about that, how capitalism was supposed to improve people's diets and quality of life and give them the wherewithal to spend leisure time doing things other than trying to secure basic necessities. And so Americans really embraced this idea, and it was linked to that consensus on the Cold War, because as we all know, the Cold War was not just about guns, it was about butter, right? We remember it was about the nylon wars. Who can best churn out, I wish I had a picture of Nixon in the kitchen debates, who can best churn out the best looking women who have time to go work out, get their nails done, go shopping, because they have all of these ovens and washing machines and vacuum cleaners and other labor-saving devices that capitalism can produce, right? Nixon and Khrushchev have a great debate about these very types of things in 1959, right? So who can raise the standard of living? And when Americans are living in these suburbs, they are projecting that vision to the world of just what American capitalism can do and how personally fulfilling it is. And in these images, we see lots of images of the nuclear family. This is the period in which people think about the country having faith in a nuclear family with a male head of household as the family breadwinner, with women in charge of sort of domestic and child-rearing duties. It's the era in which everyone has sort of kind of 2 to 3 kids. This is also an era in which Americans are conceptualizing of ourselves as a Judeo-Christian nation. Over 60% of Americans are members, registered members of a church or synagogue. This is one of the high points in American religiosity in life. And we can talk about some of the reasons why if you're interested. But, so there's this kind of consensus seemingly about what social life in the United States should look like, and a lot of it looks like images such as this. But this consensus in particular, more so than I think the first 2 points I talked about, is rather superficial, and there are a lot of tensions just beneath the surface here. If we take, for example, women as the ideal wife and mother, this really just is an ideal. In reality, nearly 50% of women are working in some capacity to help supplement their family's income in this period. And these are not single young girls who are going out to the factory for 2 years until they get married. These are working wives and moms who are going into department stores for 10, 20 hours a week and doing work as well, right? Or they're cooking and cleaning and things like that for other people's. So this whole idea of motherhood and this wife as a domestic household manager is really not attainable or the reality for the vast majority of Americans. There's also large portions of housewives who are just completely disconnected by this type of ideal, as evidenced by Betty Friedan's 1963 bestseller, The Feminist Mystique, in which she calls the house a comfortable concentration camp. Those are quotes from her. And she laments about the malaise, the disconnect, the unfulfillment that many women faced as being relegated or constrained to the lives that they have only as wives and mothers. And there's men that feel this kind of tension as well. The pressure to be the breadwinner, the pressure to be this ideal father at home and producer at work, and there's a lot of literature in the period that reflects these tensions. The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, The Organization Man. I think the modern television show Mad Men, which I've got a still from, really reflects some of these tensions well. I teach a course at UNO in the summer always called The Men and Women of Mad Men, which I bait kids into taking by promising TV shows, and then I make them read all this stuff. Right? I think that this is really real. You know, this is the period in which Hugh Hefner emerges and begins Playboy and leaves his wife and his comfortable suburban household so he can establish these bachelor pads in cities that project a different notion of masculinity. People do read the articles, and when you open up Playboy, there's lots of articles about jazz and turntables and these modern Wi-Fis and beds and what masculinity should look like that doesn't look like this, right? So there's a definite rejection of this ideal, even in the era in which people are living it. We could talk about non-heterosexual lives as well. I just don't have time. So I think that this idea is really just an ideal as we're talking about here. And certainly when we get to the next generation of Americans, the children, the baby boomers of the folks in the 1950s here, we really see these ideals coming apart, right? This is the era in which we have the women's movement, the gay liberation movement, the sexual revolution, the new left or counterculture's rejection of material culture and consumption as sort of the foundation of American life. Even if this is a fleeting moment of rejection, it happens nonetheless. People are really critically thinking about what democracy means if we disconnect it from capitalism in new kinds of ways, right? I want to stick with this social sort of conception for a minute, and it will transition us back to the politics and economy kind of notions that we were talking about before, by pointing out the fact that just about every image I have shown you thus far has been of white Americans. And that has not been by accident or because of bias. It is because this whole notion of a united nation in which there's general agreement of politics, the economy, social issues only exist when Americans ignore the reality of Jim Crow America, which was alive and well in the North, in the East, in the South, in the West in 1950, 1955, and 1960, right? So the emergence of the civil rights movement, which in reality has been going on for decades, but really comes into full force with Brown v. Board, the Brown v. Board Supreme Court decision in 1954, and the ensuing Montgomery bus boycott of '57, the sit-ins, the marches, the voter registration drives of the early '60s, begins to show us just how fragile this consensus is, right? Now I think, I think we all have different levels of knowledge about the civil rights movement, but I think all of us understand that the civil rights movement was about African Americans demanding political equality that they were supposed to be guaranteed as American citizens, right? Hopefully from the founding, but certainly from the Reconstruction era of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the 1870s. So we know that, right? We know that African Americans want the right to vote, civil rights like access to equal access to restaurants, buses, public pools. But I think what sometimes gets lost is that civil rights reformers or activists are also adamant in demanding equality in the realm of economic opportunities. The March on Washington, that's not the full title of what happens in 1963 with Martin Luther King. It's the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It's not freedom and jobs, it's jobs and freedom, right? So civil rights activists are also demanding that African Americans are able to get the equal treatment that whites have gotten in employment, in access to colleges, to universities, to unionized jobs, have the ability to become homeowners. We can talk about racial housing covenants, discriminatory practice in the home industries. We've got some real estate testers here I'm showing you on the right. Of course, African Americans want to have the nice cars, the material trappings of the American way that everyone else in the images I've shown you today has had, right? And what historians have shown time and time again is that when African Americans started to demand equal access to the full range of economic benefits that came with American citizenship that white Americans had been enjoying for decades, The political support for New Deal, Great Society versions of Keynesian economics with modest social welfare states growing starts to peter away, right? So, you know, as I said, for decades, the government there was this consensus in investing in the infirmed, in the elderly, in creating public works programs, infrastructure jobs, unemployment relief, pro-union policies, investments in public education, and these things start to erode right around 1964, 1965, right? We start to see the limits of this kind of ideas, and I'm going to run short on time, but I can point out, there's some great scholarship, and I can point it out to you in the bibliography, about how social welfare programs before the 1960s all benefited white Americans. The New Deal provided jobs especially to these Southern and Eastern European immigrants of the Ellis Island cohort and their children. And Sybil Fox's book is about this, and I can explain it more thoroughly maybe in Q&A, but I do want to give us time for this. But New Deal programs benefited these types of folks living in places like Chicago and New York, and that had to do with political machines that were ready to dole out these kinds of jobs. It had to do with the fact that lawmakers in the North were comfortable with the federal government coming in and changing the economy and giving jobs out to people. And senators from Florida said, no, stay out of our business. We don't want you guys coming in and building up someplace where the federal government's going to give jobs out to people. We like to have local control of who gets jobs, so we don't want your money, right? You can stay out. So, you know, white Southerners don't particularly benefit from the New Deal, but other whites in the United States do. There's great scholarship showing how the GI Bill, which is not written in a racist kind of way, does not really benefit African Americans because of the fact that there's only about a dozen historically black colleges and universities in the United States, right? So once these colleges and universities are saturated with the vets that come home that want to go to college, then African American vets have to go to places like the University of Oklahoma, and the University of Oklahoma says, no thanks, we don't really need you to come here or want you to come here. Or maybe African American veterans had only had a second grade education when they went off to Normandy, and they come home and they want to get an education, and that's not really practical because they weren't allowed to go to public schools in Alabama because they had to work on sharecropping plots instead, right? We could go on and on with the kind of structural limitations to African Americans achieving benefits from social welfare programs in the United States. Some of that was a little bit more deliberate. When you take a look at parts of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, one of these major New Deal acts, the way that it tries to reward farmers during the Great Depression is it rewards the landowners of farms, right? Not the tenant farmers, not the sharecroppers. The landowners are paid by the federal government to keep their fields fallow for a year to reduce the supply of, say, cotton in the marketplace and drive up prices. So the landowner then evicts the sharecroppers and the tenant farmers from their plots of land. One aspect of the Social Security Act, which was only revised decades later, that didn't help African Americans, and this was purposeful, was that all elderly people, once they hit 65, can collect Social Security because presumably you've been paying into the system as taxpayers, except agricultural workers and domestic laborers, because we don't really know about these irregular workers and how much work they've been doing, and those happen to be African Americans and Mexican Americans in the Southwest who have no political clout, right? But all of those Italian immigrants that never bothered to naturalize, we trust that you've worked, so we're not going to put any citizenship requirements on the Social Security Act. So you can see how these social welfare programs had helped white Americans for a long time. I've got some images about discriminatory lending and the GI Bill and home ownership and things like that, but again, can't get into all of it for reasons of time. So the fact of the matter is that There is still this consensus in the early 1960s that Keynesian economic spending to prime the pump, to grow the economy, to take care of the most vulnerable Americans is a good thing. And LBJ is one of these types of policymakers that still buys into this narrative, as do many others in 1960, from 64 to 68. And he says, let's do more of this stuff to stimulate the economy. We are the richest nation in the world, let's keep it that way. Let's invest in the next generation. And also LBJ recognizes that this investment in the social welfare state is also about racial equality and civil rights, right? Because you can see that economic inequality is linked to race in the United States in this period, and certainly is today, right? So when LBJ argues for things like expanded public health care with Medicare and Medicaid, for the emergence of affirmative action programs, massive investments in public education via things like Head Start and scholarships of low-income students, urban and rural development projects, expanded public housing, you see that he's investing in minority communities, right? And so do people on the right, and you start to see a drastic turn in American politics from this very moment on forward, right? Sort of the height of the civil rights movement and the emergence of the Great Society in 1965 to 68-ish. So I'm packing a lot into this slide here. When I'm talking about a turn to the right, I'm not talking about Americans who participate in this campaign of massive resistance in the South, the kind of images of vehement white supremacists like Bull Connor that we get in the South to keep Jim Crow racial order. I'm talking about the movement toward neoliberalism that begins around 1964, with the emergence of politicians like Barry Goldwater, who does not vote for the Civil Rights Bill in 1964, does not vote for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and it's not because he says he's racist. He says time and time again, I think every American should have equality, right? But I don't think the federal government should mandate that kind of equality. It's overreaching into local and state issues when it intervenes in education. This is what he says. It's very race-neutral language. Barry Goldwater says things about individuals needing the right to choose, that to, not from freedom, once again. People have the right to be racist. The government can't change their minds. By the way, I think it's deplorable, right? He says again and again and again, but people have the right to think what they want, right? People have the right or states have the right to take control of the vote, and the federal government should not be overreaching. He talks about the 10th Amendment again and again and again. And these are types of things that didn't get much political traction before 1964. No one really had a problem with the GI Bill and the ways that it's intervening into local and state affairs before that moment, right? Politicians like Ronald Reagan, he gets his start by endorsing Goldwater in 64. He gives this famous speech, sometimes just called the speech, sometimes called the Rendezvous with Destiny speech, which kind of catapults him to the national spotlight. And he becomes increasingly a voice and leader in his party when he opposes civil rights activists in California as governor. He opposes changes to housing, real estate, tax laws that would promote more equal access to housing using the race-neutral language of property rights. He leads a charge against the expansion of Medicare and Medicaid under Johnson's Great Society. Nixon operates in the same kind of ilk when this supposed law and order president encourages white parents and homeowners to defy court-ordered busing to accomplish racial integration in northern school districts, again using racially neutral language of property rights, zoning laws, taxes. I'm also sort of thinking about people like William F. Buckley, Milton Friedman, who are the behind-the-scenes operators, the political philosophers of this movement. Buckley famously founds and publishes the National Review and gives conservatism or neoliberalism, I should say, a firmer voice. Milton Friedman is, of course, the famous economist who founds the Chicago School of Economics, which becomes a basis for Reagan's supply side idea of the economy, which he talks about the deregulation of industry, declining support for unions, tax cuts to undercut the social welfare state, and these sorts of things. So we start to see that consensus on politics and the basis of the economy breaking down as we have these major social changes over race really come to the fore by the early 1960s. Now, in this lecture today, because of time, I've really given short shrift to other issues like the decline in the Cold War consensus, with things like the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and global decolonization movements talking about race and foreign policy. So, you know, we could certainly talk about that more. I do want to leave time for Q&A. And as I said, I'm going to put up a bibliography of books that I used coming to my mind as I put this PowerPoint together, in case you're interested and you want to read up on any of these issues a little bit more. So I've packed a lot in, and anything you guys want to talk about, you know, just fire away.
I was curious on the graph that showed the economic equality.
Mm-hmm.
Was that
This one or the first one?
the first one that had the
So this is a graph of income inequality. So
right, yes.
Yeah, so this is the era in which we have the least amount of income inequality in the United States.
And that was the whole U.S. Census. That was whites, blacks, American, Mexican Americans, and everybody.
Yep.
That was my curiosity.
So
when I first
this
saw
is
it, yeah.
still the index of economic inequality, and you can see it doesn't start at 0, right? So there is still inequality in the United States, and these are averages and such. But on the whole, we have more class equality, income equality in the United States from about the 40s through the late 70s, right? I think during most of this chunk of time, it's a little over 60% of Americans consider themselves middle class, and by all economic indicators are classified as middle class. And again, that has a lot to do with policies that facilitated that. It also has to do with sort of global economic dynamics too, right? I just briefly mentioned the fact that America's previous industrial competitors before World War II were really not competing as they were in 1950, right? And that our current economic competitors are not even sort of reflected in the global dynamics of trade and industry. And so that certainly helps Americans, but these types of policies that I've talked about today do as well.
In your discussion of the GI Bill, you said one of the drivers was to keep them out of the workforce. Now that's news to me. Who posited that?
Yeah, so, oh gosh, my mind is going to go blank, but there's a couple of senators who are thinking about, in the last year of the war, okay, the writing on the wall is clear, the United States is winning in Europe, it's a matter of time before things wind down in the Pacific, and all of a sudden we're going to have millions of men demobilizing and coming home. And when these men had left in 1939, 1941, etc., the United States was still in the Great Depression, right? At its lowest point before World War II, unemployment only gets down to about, this is from memory here, around 18%, right? So even though New Deal programs are making some headway and they're certainly helping individuals, they're not pulling the entire economy out of the Great Depression, right? So there are still extremely high levels of unemployment that have been saved by wartime production. We start to see employment shortages in certain sectors of the economy, and many policymakers are worried, okay, now that we're not producing tanks and uniforms and guns and all this corn for Europeans and our army to eat, what's going to happen to the economy right when the war shuts down and as we have 10 million men coming home, right? So let's stagger their re-entry into the economy a little bit. let's send some of them to 6-month mechanic schools and keep them out of the economy for 6 months. Let's let some of them go get their associate's degree. Let's send some off to four-year universities, and then you can sort of, buttress that impact a little bit. Now, that's not the only thing. As I said, there is a general acceptance of Keynesian spending, right? So the fact that Americans are not out of the Great Depression by 1938 because of government spending doesn't mean that that philosophy doesn't work. We start doing government spending in things other than sending historians to take interviews with ex-slaves or to build bridges connecting Florida to the Keys. We start doing government spending to put people to work on research and development of military technology, right? So that type of Keynesian spending continues to help create these levels of unemployment, and the GI Bill is one example of it. Government contracts with Boeing and GE and so forth are others, right? The investment in the University of California system is another way of thinking about how do we keep economic growth going to make sure we don't come back to the Great Depression when the war's over, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things I've read, and I don't know if you want to comment on this, is that with the men coming back, the women had really filled some major roles and done them well, from building planes and on. And part of it was in the media, trying to get the women to leave their jobs and let the men have those jobs. And how they portrayed that in the advertising, and I don't know how or where that started. Do you have any idea where that started, and was it through government? Was it through
both government and private industry? And that's a great question. So, in sort of around World War I, the American government came to decide war's too important for us to be left alone to figure out what we think about it, right? So we start to have these offices, variously named things like the Office of War Information, or, I can't remember what they're all named, but the government starts to message about what wars are about and what we can do to take part in the wars. And this comes about in World War I because Americans are really divided about what they think about this war. There's less division in World War II, but these offices exist nonetheless. So you get posters and images of people like Rosie the Riveter, right, that come out of government advertisements, propaganda about what we should all be doing in the war, and these offices pivot in those images at the tail end about going back home, and they work with private organizations like the National Association of Manufacturers. That's the trade group of like major industry in the United States, and they sort of collaboratively tell women it's time to go home, right? And so sometimes when I lecture about things like this, there's this great image of a woman who looks like Rosie the Riveter in her gear, like working on the gears, and she's leaning over with her hat on, and she's all sweaty, and she had been doing war work. And then I put this side by side with this image of a woman getting a pie out of an oven like this in 1950 that comes from one of these magazines, and they're using like the same imagery, and they're changing the message, and it is a collaboration between industry and government because, as the first question suggested, there is concern about getting these men back in the workforce because they are considered to be the primary breadwinner. And a lot of what women are doing in the 1960s is talking about equal pay for equal work, and the fact that they did that work in 1944 helps them to convincingly make those arguments in 1968 or 78 or whatever, right? We're still not there.
Thank you very much, Dr. I want to know more